Okay, so there's no video about this on YouTube, and I'm working on my public speaking skills, my ability to be articulate, since I want to be a writer. I want to engage in debates and dialectics with priests, with bishops, with rabbis, with shifus, with leaders of every major religion, get them to engage in debates with one another that I will moderate, get them to engage in dialectics, which is similar to a debate. I'll describe exactly what a dialectic is and why it is foundational to a democracy, and without dialectics, we are suffering. Dialectics are like a debate, except instead of being adversarial, both sides recognize that they could be wrong about their ideas and exchange ideas with the ability to say, "You're right. That argument I made is full of logical fallacies, and your argument does seem stronger, and the evidence does indeed seem to favor your point of view on this particular issue. I will have to rethink my point of view on that issue." And without that humility, without that foundation of wisdom, without those dialectics where we are willing to have our ideas torn to shreds so that we may burn off the deadwood, burn off the stupidity and ignorance that plagues all of us, we all remain stupid and ignorant because we're too prideful to admit when we're wrong about something. So we need to go back to understanding what wisdom is and teaching kids the importance of wisdom. And the beginning of wisdom is the ability to admit when you are wrong and to know that when you study anything, you could be wrong about it. When you study a controversial issue within politics, within any of the social sciences or natural sciences, the conclusion you come to could be erroneous. So you should debate people that are more intelligent and more well informed, more well read than you on a particular issue to see if you are incorrect. If your arguments and evidence and claims can survive all the counter arguments from someone who has a higher IQ than you and has read more books than you, if it can survive that critique, then you are on to something. If it gets torn to shreds, then you gotta go back to the drawing board, add more nuance, rethink things, come to a new conclusion. You may end up agreeing with that other person, or you may end up engaging in a synthesis where you arrive at an even higher level of understanding and go up that level of comprehension that I will explain in a later video. Anyway, so let's get to reading this article. Saint Augustine of Hippo, born in 354 and deceased in 430, was probably the most influential Christian thinker after the Gospel writers and St. Paul. It is to him that we owe such doctrines, the ideas of original sin and predestination. So, the idea of original sin that is so essential to Catholicism was conceived of by St. Augustine. It's pretty amazing. Yet he has traditionally been unpopular with those concerned about Christian treatment of Jews over the centuries. It is a disapproval that was expressed just 8 years ago by the popular historian James Carroll in his much read book, Constantine's Sword. Constantine's Sword. Carroll wrote that Augustine and his followers believed that Jews must be allowed to survive, but never to thrive, so that their public misery would broadcast that the Jews proper punishments for the refusal to recognize Jesus as their one true Savior. And the rest, goes the claim, was history. But no, it was bloody history. Um, regardless, it says as the rest as and that, and the rest goes to claim was bloody history. Usually, and the rest goes to claim was history, but he put bloody history because obviously the blood of the Jews. He's laying that at the hand of Saint Augustine and his alleged anti-Semitic views. But in a book, Augustine and the Jews, Paula Fredrickson, a Boston University religion professor and self-proclaimed Augustinista, appends the received wisdom. Fredrickson is no coddler of anti-Judaism. A former Catholic who long ago converted to Judaism, she was excuse me, one of Mel Gibson's most acerbic critics when he released his movie The Passion of the Christ. But her book's subtitle, so the book's name is Augustine and the Jews, and the subtitle is A Christian defense of Jews and Judaism, describes what she contends was Augustine's actual stance on the topic, one which she says was little short of revolutionary. So Augustine's actual stance on Jews was actually a bad revolutionary in a good way. Excerpts from Dan Van Biema's interview with Frederickson follows. So the question is, so Augustine is not the bad guy regarding the Jews that historians so often conjure. Frederickson, let's say that Augustine was much more benign socially, at least towards Jews, than people have usually thought. Question, what caused you to question received wisdom? Back in 1993, I was reading a work of Augustine's attacking a Christian heretic. Usually, when ancient Orthodox Christians did terrible things about heretics, they found even worse things to say about Jews. Until 390, until 395, Augustine had not been much different. But here he was, writing about one of the flashiest heresies of his time, marshaling arguments unbelievably positive, and marshaling his arguments unbelievably and marshaling as arguments unbelievably positive things about Jews. That's not grammatically correct. I mean, I suppose it is, but it's tad archaic. So I'm gonna say it like this. He marshaled arguments that were unbelievably positive about Jews. As I read further, my scalp tingled. I'd been working on Augustine for 20 years, and I'd never seen anything like this before. Not only could I establish that he had changed his position, but I could locate this shift in his thinking very precisely to the 4-year period when he also wrote his monumental book, Confessions. So, he just flip flopped on the topic. It was more complicated. Imagine if all our public discourse was conducted to the language of legal combat. His was. Learned argument did not aim to represent an opponent's position fairly, but to make it look as ridiculous as possible. Part of his rhetoric regarding Jews reflected this. Also, Christians using harsh language against Jews were often actually aiming at Christian opponents, whom they painted as darkly as possible by comparing them to hostile caricatures of Jews. Okay, so when Christians back then, when Christians were attacking other Christians, they would insult them by comparing them to Jews. That's how much the Jews were hated in the early days of Christianity. So when Augustine used such language, he meant nothing by it. You can mean many things by it, but he's often dealing with what you might call rhetorical Jews rather than real Jews. It's also important to remember that for much of Augustine's lifetime, Jews were Roman citizens with the rights Jews were Roman citizens with the rights of citizens. This begins to change in the late 4th century when the emperor decides to link government closely with one particular form of Christianity, a big faith-based initiative. With the real societal but the real social disenfranchisement of Jews occurred long after Augustine. Medieval persecutions and much later, the Holocaust were not events that Augustine could have imagined. But still, his words helped shape that history, even if as an unintended consequence. Yes, I hear my mother's voice echoing in my head. If you can't say nothing nice, don't say anything at all. Even some of the milder things he said had terrible consequences. There is a verse in Psalms, bend down their backs always, that he, reading Paul, applied to the Jews. So Augustine took the 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 verse in Psalms, bend down their backs always, and apply it to the Jews. He meant by this phrase that when Jews read the Bible, their posture was oriented downward this world, downward toward this world rather than upward towards heaven. Much later, churchmen will misinterpret Augustine to be saying, sit on Jewish backs until they bend. The things that were later done on his authority were a horrifying misreading. The things that were later done on his authority were a horrifying misreading, and he himself would have been horrified. How do we know that? There were two kinds of evidence. There were two kinds of evidence. God, I'm so when I'm reading, like when I speak, do I stumble over my words as much as this? No, I don't. When I'm reading something out loud, I do, which is strange. Um, but I need to learn how to do this because it will make me more articulate. But let's continue after a short pause. How do we know that? There are two kinds of evidence from his life. Recently, we've discovered a little nice memo of his to a fellow bishop on behalf of a plaintiff, telling that bishop to get his sticky fingers off this guy's property. Plaintiff, whose side he takes, is a Jew, and even Augustine even quotes St. Paul to the effect of not creating a scandal in front of the Jews. But more important is the theological 180-degree turn Augustine does between 395 and 398. He has moved from demeaning the Jews and disparaging Judaism to becoming the only theologian of his era to make them an important positive part of his view of God and humanity. How so? Well, modern Christians take it for granted that Christ really had a fleshly body. Not all ancient Christians agreed. Augustine, in the course of his arguing for Christ's incarnation, this intimate relationship between divinity This intimate, this intimate relationship between divinity and humanity explicitly parallels it to God's relationship with the Jews. He writes that Catholics and Jews stand as one community over against pagans and heretics, that Jesus and his apostles, including Paul, lived as Torah observant Jews for the whole of their lives, and he urges that God himself would punish any king who tried to interfere with the Jews' practice of Judaism. These ideas preserve spaces for Jewishness in Christian culture, space that in much more toxic cultures of the Christian Middle Ages helped save Jewish lives. Although that too was an unintended consequence, he could not have possibly imagined them being in that kind of danger. What about the impression that although Augustine said that Christians should not kill Jews, he still wanted them to be miserable, to survive but not thrive? That's not what Augustine said. That's what Carroll said that the other historian who was critical of Augustine said believed that uh, what was his name? He's a famous historian, James Carroll. Sorry, James Carroll said that Augustine believed that the Jews should be allowed to survive but not to thrive. So, putting that in context, what about the impression that although Augustine said that Christians should not kill Jews, he still wanted them to be miserable, to survive but not to thrive, as an example of what happens to people who do not accept Christ? Do not kill them is from Psalm 59, which Augustine uses to argue that Christians should not kill the Jews. Jewish traditions. Okay, excuse me. I misread that. Do not kill them is from Psalm 59, which Augustine uses to argue that Christians should not kill the Jews' Jewish traditions because they come from God. He believes that God himself maintained the Jews' existence as a people because their devotion to the Torah broadcasts the antiquity and authenticity of the Jewish Bible, which Augustine held contained prophecies of Christ. So yes, he thought the Jews should survive, but not thrive is but so yes, he thought the Jews should survive, but the not thrive line is a non-Augustine the, the but not thrive line is a non-Augustinian edition of a later period. Okay, so what she's saying is that Augustine never said that Jews should not be able to thrive. Followers of Augustine said that Augustine said that Jews should be able to survive but not thrive. But Augustine himself never said that. I don't like how these people don't say things clearly sometimes because they don't say it the way I say it, so it confuses me. Like when I'm reading, it's fine, but when I'm trying to pronounce it, it's weird to say things in a manner that I don't think is very lucid because I try to make what I say as lucid as possible, and not to use archaic sort of um, language or not archaic, but ostentatious, pretentious language. Pretentious is the word I'm looking for. Pretentious. If your deconstruction of the received view of Augustine on the Jews is so new, do you think it will be controversial among scholars? I don't know. Scholarship in general Scholarship in this general area is changing. In the past 50 years, so much archaeological evidence has appeared that suggests positive Jewish Gentile relations during Augustine's period and after. The ground has been laid for revision. Does your history of Augustine and the Jews have any relevance for modern Christians and Jews? I think so. Fairly dark history of Christian Jewish relations, his theology turns out to be one of the very few bright lights. These ancient Christian Jewish interactions are much more complex and interesting than are the received ideas about them. Our lives are still shaped by this history, so it's important to get it right. And if modern Jews and Christians attempting dialogue find Augustine a prison for common ground, that would make me really happy. It would be an unintended consequence of my book, but a good one. Wow, at the end, that was really good because she talked like a normal person. So there you go. That's my attempt to be articulate and to read words that are not my own. And I will do this more often in order to become more articulate and expand my vocabulary and make myself a better speaker.